September 6, 1914. The morning mist clings to the ground, making everything feel eerily quiet. For a moment, the battlefield feels like it's holding its breath. But you know that can't last long. A few moments ago, you were trying to catch some sleep in the muddy trench, your blanket not offering much in the way of warmth. But now? Now you're awake, staring down a war that's already dragged on for months, a war that has no end in sight. The Germans are pushing fast and hard, their relentless advance through Belgium and France threatening to overrun the entire country. You've heard the stories. Their tactics are efficient, brutal, and frighteningly effective. Their troops, well-equipped and battle-hardened, seem to be everywhere at once, like a flood of steel and gunpowder. They've taken city after city, advancing with terrifying precision. Paris is within their sights, and the world seems to be holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. But today, the French are about to do something unexpected. You're part of the force preparing to counterattack. But you know this isn't going to be easy. The Germans are dug in, their positions are strong, and they have the momentum. But somehow, in the chaos of war, there's a flicker of hope. The French, under General Joseph Joffre, are about to risk everything in a bold move to push the Germans back. They're betting everything on a battle that could either be a resounding success or a disastrous failure. You can smell the gunpowder in the air. There's an unsettling quiet in the moments before the storm, but the hum of distant artillery tells you that something big is coming. The rumble of the guns grows louder, and you can feel the earth vibrate beneath your feet. It's strange. On any other day, the noise would be deafening, but today it feels almost muted, as if the world itself is holding its breath. Around you, soldiers are preparing, checking their gear, and whispering nervously. Everyone knows the stakes are high, but no one really understands just how high until the first shots are fired. You've got a rifle in your hands and a job to do, but the reality of what's coming sets in. How many of us will make it through this day? How many will fall before the battle is over? Somewhere, deep in the trenches, the French and British forces are organizing their response. You can feel the collective tension in the air, thick enough to slice with a knife. The brass are making their final preparations, and soon enough the word will spread like wildfire. The Battle of the Marne is on. The battlefield, already soaked in blood from months of fighting, will see more death today than anyone thought possible. The Germans, arrogant in their belief that victory was near, are about to be caught off guard. You can hear the sound of marching feet growing louder. Soldiers are gathering, organizing into their battalions, ready to take on the enemy. The anticipation is almost unbearable. Every man knows that the decision to advance could lead to either certain victory or an absolute rout. There's no middle ground, and there's no turning back. Today will decide the course of the war. So you steel yourself, feeling the weight of history pressing down on your shoulders. You've heard the rumors of what the Germans are capable of, but today, you're about to find out firsthand. The calm before the storm is finally over. The Battle of the Marne is about to begin, and you are standing at the edge of a world forever changed. As the first shells burst overhead, the earth trembles beneath your boots. There's no hiding in the trenches now. This is it. The Germans, thinking they had the upper hand, have pushed deep into France. But the French and their allies aren't about to let them waltz in like it's a Sunday stroll. It's time to dig in, hold the line, and pray that the next shell isn't for you. It's early in the war, and the battle lines are far from settled. The trench systems stretch for miles, cutting the landscape into a maze of barbed wire, mud, and death. You can hear the distant rumble of artillery, but there's no way to predict when the next shell will fall. The sound of shrapnel screaming through the air is a constant reminder that, in this new era of warfare, there's no safe place. The trenches have become both a lifeline and a death trap, providing some protection from enemy fire, but also becoming a claustrophobic, suffocating prison, where every breath feels heavy with the weight of the war. The Germans have been relentless, pushing forward with determination. convinced that their superior tactics and technology would easily bring them victory. But what they don't understand is the resilience of the French and the British, who are now ready to defend every inch of their land. They've seen the horrors of trench warfare firsthand and know that the fight for France won't be won with sheer force alone. It will be a battle of endurance, of patience, and, above all, of willpower. This is where the real fight begins, not just for territory, but for survival. The soldiers in the trenches know they are on the edge of a pivotal moment in history. The fate of nations rests on their shoulders, and they have no choice but to stand their ground. The French, with the support of their British allies, dig in deep, preparing to face the storm of artillery that is sure to come. Each man feels the weight of the war pressing down on him, the knowledge that this could be his final stand. But there's no time to dwell on fear, only on the mission at hand. The sounds of the battlefield are deafening. The roar of cannon fire, the shrieks of falling shells, the cries of comrades, and the constant buzz of machine gun fire. The air is thick with smoke, and the landscape is scarred by the brutal artillery bombardment. But through it all, the soldiers hold the line, knowing that the next wave of German forces is about to crash down upon them. As the French and British forces brace for the oncoming storm, there's a sense of unity that transcends the chaos. In the trenches, there's no distinction between nationalities. Only soldiers, brothers in arms, facing the same hellish reality. The Germans, too, are fighting for their own survival, but their push for domination has brought them to this pivotal moment where the outcome of the war hangs in the balance. The first clash has begun, and neither side is willing to back down. In the midst of the carnage, it becomes clear that this war will not be won by quick advances or short-lived victories. It will be a war of attrition, a test of endurance, strategy, and sheer willpower. For the men in the trenches, there's no time for second thoughts, only for fighting, surviving, and holding the line against the storm of steel and fire that will soon descend upon them. The battle for France is just beginning, and it will be a fight like no other. The French forces, led by General Joseph Joffre, are ready. They've planned this for months, and their counteroffensive is now underway. As you watch French soldiers scramble to reposition, you can feel the shift in momentum. The Germans didn't expect this, and now they're playing catch-up. It's like a chess match, except the pieces are soldiers, and the board is covered in mud and blood. The initial surprise of the attack reverberates through the ranks. After months of brutal stalemate, it's as if the French forces have come alive. The relentless barrage of artillery that once pounded their positions has now turned into a weapon in their favor. Joffre's plan was simple but bold: to strike at the heart of the German lines, where they were stretched thin, and push them back. The French soldiers, who had been on the defensive for so long, are now the aggressors. And the Germans, caught off guard by the ferocity and speed of the attack, are scrambling to adjust. The key to this counteroffensive is the element of surprise. The Germans, having grown accustomed to dominating the battlefield, were not prepared for a swift and organized French attack. They were expecting more of the same, a slow, grinding war of attrition. Instead, they're faced with a coordinated assault, where French infantry, supported by artillery and cavalry, are moving fast and hitting hard. The French have learned from their early missteps and are now fighting with precision and purpose. The French soldiers push forward through the dense mud of the trenches, their spirits lifted by the sudden shift in momentum. For the first time in what feels like an eternity, they're not just holding the line, they're advancing. The sound of their rifle fire mixes with the roar of artillery as they move forward, taking advantage of every opportunity to force the Germans back. It's a grueling fight, with both sides facing the horrors of trench warfare. But for the French, it's a fight that feels like redemption. They've suffered greatly, and now they are determined to take back what was lost. As the Germans scramble to react, they find themselves facing a force that is no longer passive. Their positions, once considered impregnable, are now under threat. The French have taken the initiative, and it's clear that the Germans are struggling to adapt to the new reality. Commanders frantically issue orders, but communication lines are chaotic, and their troops, who were confident in their earlier gains, are now retreating or disorganized. The French are relentless, pushing them from one trench to the next, reclaiming ground with every step. The counterattack forces the Germans into a retreat, but it's not an orderly withdrawal. The French pressure is too much, and soon the Germans are forced to abandon their positions in haste, leaving behind weapons, equipment, and the fortifications they had so carefully constructed. The battlefield becomes a patchwork of craters, shattered trenches, and discarded gear. The once steadfast German lines are broken, and the French forces, though exhausted and battered, have gained a vital victory. This counteroffensive marks a significant turning point in the war. The momentum shifts, and the Germans are no longer the ones in control. The French, who had been fighting not just for victory but for survival, have demonstrated their resolve and their capability to turn the tide. For the Germans, the psychological impact is profound. They thought they had the upper hand, but the French, in a sudden and decisive move, have proven that they are far from beaten. The battle for France is far from over, but the French counterattack has shown that the war is not just a battle of attrition, it's a battle of will, strategy, and the ability to strike when the moment is right. With the Marne River just ahead, both sides scramble to control the crucial crossing points. Every inch of ground is fiercely contested. You feel the pressure mount as the French push back the Germans, inching closer to the riverbanks, determined to hold their ground. Who will retreat, and who will stand firm? The Marne is not just a river, it's a symbol of the turning point in the war. The race to control it is more than just a tactical maneuver. It represents the fate of the front lines and the strategic future of both armies. The Germans, having pushed deep into France, are determined to continue their advance. They have tasted success and are now pushing for victory, hoping to deliver a blow that will bring an end to the war in their favor. But the French, bolstered by their allies, are not ready to concede. This is the last line of defense before Paris, and they will fight to the last man to prevent its fall. As the battle intensifies, artillery fire shakes the very earth beneath your feet. The Germans, having come this far, are relentless. But the French, entrenched and organized, hold their ground. The trenches, once a symbol of stalemate, now become the launch pads for aggressive offensives. Each side is desperate to gain a foothold on the riverbank, knowing that whoever controls the crossings will have the advantage in the coming days. The sound of rifle fire and exploding shells fills the air as the two sides inch forward, their positions fluctuating with each wave of attack and counterattack. The landscape is a grim tableau of war: shattered trees, scorched earth, and the constant presence of mud. Both sides are exhausted, their soldiers physically and mentally drained from the relentless fighting. Yet, neither can afford to relent. The French, pushed back by the German advance, now find themselves holding their ground with a newfound resolve. This is not just about stopping the Germans, it's about keeping their homeland safe and denying the enemy the opportunity to crush their morale once and for all. Every inch of ground is a victory, and every step forward brings them closer to the Marne, closer to survival. Meanwhile, the Germans, who had anticipated a swift victory, are now facing the reality of a prolonged conflict. The French have proven more resilient than expected, and the momentum has shifted. The sight of the Marne River ahead serves as a reminder that, while they have come this far, they are still far from their goal. The French are fighting tooth and nail to keep them from crossing, and the race to the river is turning into a brutal contest of willpower. The Germans, though initially confident, are beginning to question their ability to break through. As the battle rages on, the Marne River looms larger in the minds of both armies. It represents a line in the sand, the boundary between retreat and victory. The French, holding the high ground, can feel the German pressure mounting. With every wave of assault, the ground shifts, sometimes in favor of the French, sometimes in favor of the Germans. The river's crossings are becoming the focus of every maneuver, every tactical decision. The outcome of the race will determine not only the fate of the battle but also the strategic direction of the war. In the end, as both armies continue their push, it becomes clear that the battle for control of the Marne River will be one of the most decisive moments of the conflict. For the French, this is the moment of survival. For the Germans, it's the moment of reckoning. The race to the river is more than just a struggle for territory, it's a race for the future of France and the war itself. And as the pressure builds, only one side will emerge victorious. The fate of the Marne will mark the next chapter in the long, drawn-out struggle of World War I. You've heard rumors that Paris is in danger. The Germans are advancing, and their cannons are thundering ever closer. But the city, with its millions of inhabitants, isn't going down without a fight. As you march closer to the front, you can't help but wonder if this might be the last time you see the City of Lights. Paris has always been more than just a capital. It's the beating heart of France, a symbol of its culture, its spirit, and its will to survive. But now, that heart is under threat. The German forces have pushed deeper into France, and the capital is within their sights. The city's once vibrant streets, teeming with life, now feel heavy with the uncertainty of impending danger. The sound of artillery and the growing rumble of approaching troops fills the air, sending waves of fear through every district. People whisper in the streets, wondering whether the Germans will breach the city's walls or if the French military can hold them off long enough to turn the tide. The city's residents, while anxious, remain resilient. Women, children, and the elderly are being evacuated. But Paris itself isn't crumbling under the pressure. Workers and citizens are rallying together, building barricades, organizing defenses, and readying the city for the worst. The once bustling boulevards, known for their cafes and lively crowds, now have an eerie, tense atmosphere. It's a city at war, and though the Eiffel Tower still stands proudly above the streets, the feeling of impending disaster hangs in the air. As you approach the front lines, the contrast between the chaos of the city and the rigid discipline of the soldiers becomes apparent. The French military has gathered its strength, and as the German forces get closer, the soldiers dig in and prepare for one of the most critical moments in the war. The defense of Paris has become a rallying cry for all French soldiers, not just because of its strategic importance, but because the city symbolizes their resistance to the German invasion. They know that losing Paris would not only be a military defeat, but a moral blow that could break the spirit of the entire nation. At the front, you can feel the tension mounting. Every soldier is aware of what's at stake. They are not just fighting for military positions, they are fighting for the soul of France itself. The Germans have every advantage in terms of numbers and firepower, but the French forces are fueled by their determination to protect their city. The will to defend Paris runs deep in the hearts of the soldiers, and it's clear that this battle will be more than just a tactical engagement, it's a battle for survival. The French military, under the leadership of General Joffre, is scrambling to reinforce Paris's defenses. Paris's forts, previously thought to be sufficient for protection, are now being prepared for a siege. Yet, in the heart of the city, there is still a glimmer of hope. While the cannon fire grows louder, French forces are mounting a counteroffensive, determined to keep the Germans from reaching the city gates. The French are fighting with everything they have. Every trench, every street, every inch of the city's defenses becomes a testament to their willpower. As you march closer to the front, you can hear the sounds of the battle in the distance, the cries of men, the thunder of artillery, and the knowledge that Paris, the City of Lights, is holding its breath. Will the defenders hold out long enough to repel the German advance? Will the city's defenses hold firm, or will Paris fall to the German forces? The fate of France hangs in the balance, and the world watches, waiting to see whether Paris will stand tall or be swallowed by the darkness of war. Suddenly, it happens. The Germans begin to retreat. After weeks of pushing forward, they're pulling back in a panic. It's not just a retreat, it's a rout. You can't believe it one moment, they're advancing with confidence, and the next, they're scrambling for their lives. You wonder if they ever saw this coming. The change is almost instantaneous. For months, the German forces have been relentless, advancing steadily and driving deep into enemy territory. Their advance had been methodical, their artillery devastating, and their morale high. The Germans had believed their victory was inevitable. The French and British forces had been pushed back, their lines broken in several places, and it seemed only a matter of time before the war would be won on the German terms. But now, something has changed. It starts with the sound of artillery fire growing softer, then stopping altogether. The once unyielding advance is slowing, and the soldiers who had been marching with purpose and pride now appear disoriented. The change in the air is palpable. What was once a tide of German triumph is now a series of chaotic retreats, units scattering as the French and British forces begin to press forward. The momentum has shifted, and for the first time in months, the Germans are fighting a desperate rearguard action instead of advancing. The reasons for the sudden collapse are complex, but it becomes clear that the German forces, stretched thin from months of intense fighting, are simply unable to continue the momentum they had built. The French, with the support of the British, have mounted a powerful counteroffensive. German supply lines, once secure, are now disrupted, leaving their troops without the necessary resources to continue their assault. On the front lines, soldiers who had once moved with the confidence of conquerors are now retreating in disarray, leaving behind equipment, artillery, and even wounded comrades as they flee. The psychological shock of the retreat is felt across the German ranks. The men who had once believed in their inevitable victory now find themselves retreating, with their commanders scrambling to reorganize and stabilize their forces. The morale of the troops is shattered. Many soldiers, once proud and disciplined, are now questioning the very foundation of the war effort. What had seemed like a victorious march has turned into a chaotic retreat, and the loss of confidence is evident in every soldier's face. For the French and British forces, the shock of the German retreat is met with disbelief and elation. For the first time in the war, it feels as though victory is within reach. The momentum is theirs, and they press forward with renewed vigor. The roar of artillery and the sound of advancing infantry fill the air as the Germans, now on the defensive, struggle to slow the tide of the Allied counterattack. The French soldiers, who had endured months of bombardment and retreat, are now tasting victory as they push the Germans back toward their own lines. The route is swift and brutal. The once proud German forces are now in full retreat, their confidence shattered by the unexpected reversal. What had seemed like a steady, unstoppable advance is now a broken, disorganized retreat, leaving German soldiers to wonder how it all went wrong. The retreat is not just a military setback, it is a collapse of the very spirit that had fueled their earlier success. As the dust settles and the echoes of retreating German soldiers fade, one thing becomes clear. The tide of the war has shifted. What was once a brutal march of German conquest is now a scramble for survival. The retreat of the Germans marks a dramatic turning point in the war, and for the Allies, it is the beginning of the end of the German offensive. What seemed like an unstoppable force has been turned back, and the momentum is now in the hands of those who have fought so hard to hold the line. As artillery bursts in the distance, you realize how much things have changed. The precision of artillery strikes, the speed of communication between units' technology has become as much a part of the battle as the soldiers themselves. Radios crackle with orders, and spotters relay coordinates to gunners. The sound of shells whizzing by is like a symphony of destruction. World War I was a turning point in military history. marked by the introduction of technology that would shape the future of warfare. While rifles, bayonets, and the bravery of soldiers remained critical, it was the innovation in communication and artillery that dramatically altered the pace and nature of combat. These advances made the war more deadly and, at the same time, more strategic than any conflict that came before it. Artillery, long a staple of warfare, became an even more lethal force with the advent of new technology. The large, cumbersome guns of previous wars were replaced by more mobile and efficient artillery pieces that could hit targets with greater accuracy. With the use of spotters, soldiers specially trained to observe enemy movements from a distance, the gunners could pinpoint enemy positions with remarkable precision. These spotters would send back real-time data on the target's location, allowing the artillery to fire with increased accuracy. This technological leap meant that troops, who might once have been able to hide in trenches or behind cover, were now within reach of long-range bombardment that could level entire positions in a matter of minutes. The innovation didn't stop there. The advent of barometric fuses allowed artillery shells to detonate at a predetermined height, sending shrapnel down on enemy soldiers, causing devastating damage. This marked a shift from traditional explosive artillery, which relied on the blast to cause destruction, to a more precise tactical use of shrapnel and timed explosions. The result was that the artillery barrage was not just a symbol of destruction, it was a tool of precision and efficiency that redefined battlefield tactics. Alongside artillery, communication technology evolved in leaps and bounds. For much of the war, commanders on the front lines struggled with slow, unreliable methods of communication. Horses and messengers were often used to relay orders, but this was cumbersome and inefficient, particularly in the chaos of battle. The introduction of telegraphs and later field radios revolutionized communication, allowing orders to be transmitted quickly across vast distances. The radio became a key asset in coordinating strikes, and entire networks of communication lines were established to keep commanders in constant contact with the troops. This made it possible to call in artillery support with incredible speed, shifting the advantage to the side with the best communication infrastructure. But while these technological advancements brought incredible power, they also introduced a new set of challenges. The reliance on communication networks meant that if they were disrupted, whether by enemy fire or sabotage, commanders could quickly lose control of the battlefield. The same radios that provided quick coordination also became targets. A single damaged line could mean chaos on the front, as troops would no longer be able to receive orders or requests for reinforcements. Likewise, artillery, despite its increased accuracy, could also be counterproductive. A poorly placed shot could end up striking friendly positions, turning technological advantages into liabilities. The role of technology in World War I marked a sharp departure from the wars of the past. It allowed for greater coordination and precision, making battles faster and more lethal. However, it also introduced new vulnerabilities. Flaws in communication lines or artillery accuracy could have devastating consequences. The war was no longer fought just with weapons, but with the systems that supported them, and the balance between technological advancement and its limitations was a constant struggle. As the war raged on, it became clear that technology would be an indispensable part of future conflicts. The innovations introduced in World War I would lay the groundwork for the way wars would be fought for the next century, where the speed of communication and the precision of weaponry would become as vital as the bravery of the soldiers themselves. The symphony of destruction on the battlefield was not just the work of human hands, it was the result of machines, radios, and artillery that could change the course of the war with a single strike. There's no time for thought, only action. You're caught in the grind of endless skirmishes, desperate to hold your position, but it's starting to take its toll. The madness of war begins to feel endless. The stench of death, the constant explosions, the fatigue, it's all weighing down on you. You can't help but wonder how much longer you can hold on. The trenches are a world unto themselves, a harsh, unforgiving place where the very air seems heavy with the constant threat of death. Soldiers live in a constant state of alertness, their bodies and minds pushed to the brink. The line between life and death is thin, and every moment is a struggle to stay alive. The deafening sound of artillery shells bursting overhead, the rapid exchange of rifle fire, and the screams of men in pain, these are the daily sounds of warfare. It's a symphony of destruction, and there's no escape from it. But perhaps the most brutal toll of war is not the physical wounds, it's the unseen toll that war takes on the mind. Soldiers are forced to endure the unimaginable. The sight of their comrades falling, the never-ending barrage of explosives, the isolation of the trenches, and the fear of what comes next. The constant state of fear and stress begins to erode their sense of self, leaving many soldiers feeling numb and detached from reality. The battlefront is relentless, and survival is the only priority. For many soldiers, the mental strain becomes unbearable. The term shell shock was coined during World War I to describe what we now know as PTSD. It wasn't understood at the time, but the symptoms were clear. Soldiers would exhibit signs of extreme anxiety, uncontrollable tremors, and an inability to function normally. The horrors of the battlefield had etched themselves into the soldiers' minds, leaving scars that couldn't be seen, but were felt deeply. Some soldiers would completely break down under the pressure, unable to continue fighting or even to leave their bunkers. Even for those who didn't break down, the mental strain of war left an indelible mark. The constant exposure to violence and death led to a numbing of the emotions. Soldiers became desensitized to the suffering around them, forced to push their feelings down to survive. Yet, the toll was always there, silently wearing away at their mental health, creating a generation of men who would return home forever changed. Many found it impossible to reintegrate into civilian life, haunted by the memories of what they had witnessed and experienced. The monotony of trench warfare also added to the soldiers' mental exhaustion. Days would pass without any significant battles, and soldiers would be left to sit in the mud, surrounded by filth and decay. There was little to do other than wait for the next attack, and the uncertainty of what the future held became a constant source of stress. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as soldiers lived in a suspended state of anticipation, never knowing when the next battle would begin or whether they would make it through the next day. There was no true rest for the soldiers. When they weren't in combat, they were preparing for it, repairing trenches, or digging new ones. Sleep was elusive when it came. It was a shallow, fitful rest, often interrupted by nightmares of the battlefield. For some, the nightmares never stopped. The mental toll of war extended far beyond the front lines, and soldiers carried the weight of their experiences long after the war ended. The madness of war is not just in the chaos of the battlefield, but in the quiet moments between attacks, where the weight of fear and death settles into the bones. For the soldiers of World War I, the true battle was often fought within their own minds, a battle they would continue to fight for the rest of their lives. As the lines shift and new alliances form, you can't help but feel like you're fighting for something greater than just your country. The French, the British, and even the Belgians, everyone's in this together now. But in the chaos of war, trust becomes a fragile thing. Who's really got your back? And how long will this uneasy alliance last? At the onset of World War I, each nation entered the conflict with its own motivations, its own priorities, and a fierce sense of patriotism. The French were determined to defend their homeland after the German advance in 1914. The British, with their empire at stake, sought to preserve their global influence. And the Belgians, initially caught in the crossfire, were desperately trying to protect their sovereignty. But the brutality of the war soon made clear that no nation could stand alone, and these disparate countries had to put aside their differences and form an alliance. The French and British had long been allies, but the scope and scale of World War I would test the durability of their partnership like never before. The British Expeditionary Force was among the first to land in France, and from the very start, they faced the harsh realities of trench warfare. The French had already been entrenched for months and were battle-hardened, but even they had been caught off guard by the scale of the German assault. The British forces, with their more rigid, traditional approach to warfare, were initially at a disadvantage, and tensions between the two allies began to surface. In the trenches, the cooperation between French and British troops was far from seamless. Each side brought its own methods, its own logistics, and its own way of thinking about the war. The French, with their deeply ingrained military traditions, often found themselves at odds with the more formal, structured British. The British, on the other hand, struggled to adapt to the French tactics of constant engagement and territorial defense. Despite these differences, both armies knew they had no choice but to fight side by side. If they couldn't trust each other, they would both lose. The Belgians, who had been overrun by the Germans early in the war, became an important part of the Allied effort after their country was invaded. Their role, though often overlooked, was significant. Their resistance in the face of German aggression had galvanized international support, and by the time the British and French armies reached the Belgian front, the fate of Belgium was tied to the outcome of the war. The addition of the Belgian army brought a new dynamic to the Allied forces, but the Belgians too struggled to find their footing alongside their more powerful allies. Their national pride was deeply wounded by the occupation, and the bitterness of their suffering was not easily forgotten. The new alliances in World War I were based on necessity rather than a shared ideology or common culture, and that fact often made cooperation difficult. As the war dragged on, the trust that had initially been forged in the heat of battle began to show cracks. Misunderstandings over tactics, supply shortages, and the sheer exhaustion of trench warfare created friction among the Allies. But despite these tensions, they continued to fight together, their survival depending on the fragile web of alliances that bound them. The war's stalemate forced each nation to put aside its differences, but the question of trust would remain ever present. Who truly had the best interests of the alliance in mind? Was it the French, who had the most at stake, or the British, whose empire needed to be preserved? Could the Belgians, who had suffered so greatly, ever fully trust the larger powers that had come to their aid? The war might have united them temporarily, but the uneasy peace that followed would reveal the complexities and uncertainties that had been lurking beneath the surface. As the conflict stretched on, the ever-changing nature of alliances in World War I proved to be one of its most unpredictable elements. Nations that had once been bitter enemies found themselves cooperating, while former allies struggled with the weight of shared sacrifice. The war would end with the signing of the armistice in 1918. But the seeds of discord sown between the allies would ultimately have long-lasting effects on the post-war world. The changing lines of war, driven by both necessity and ideology, had not only reshaped the battlefield, but had also redefined the relationships between nations. The question of trust, once a fleeting concern, would become a defining issue in the years that followed. The battle rages on, but behind the front lines, an unseen war is being waged. The battle for supplies. You realize that without food, ammunition, and reinforcements, there's no way you'll be able to hold your ground. It's a race to the supply lines, and whoever controls them controls the fate of the battle. In World War I, the importance of logistics cannot be overstated. While soldiers were fighting on the front lines, a parallel struggle was taking place far behind the trenches. The success or failure of any army was ultimately determined by how well its supply lines were maintained and protected. A well-supplied army could continue to fight, adapt, and hold ground, but without the necessary resources, even the most skilled and motivated troops would be forced to retreat. The supply chain was an intricate and complex web, requiring careful planning and coordination. Ammunition, Food, medical supplies, and equipment had to be transported from rear depots to the soldiers in the trenches, often across treacherous terrain. The weather was a constant challenge. Heavy rain could turn roads into impassable mud, and snow could freeze supply routes, making them unusable. The longer the conflict dragged on, the more strained the supply lines became. As both sides pushed further into enemy territory, the logistics networks were stretched to their breaking point, forcing armies to innovate in order to keep their forces operational. The transportation of supplies was primarily carried out using trains, trucks, and horses. Trains were the most efficient means of moving large quantities of goods, but they were vulnerable to sabotage, artillery fire, and air raids. The Germans, for example, often targeted French and British railways, hoping to disrupt the flow of supplies and create chaos behind enemy lines. In retaliation, the Allies did the same, using their air superiority to bomb enemy rail stations and logistics hubs. As a result, both sides were forced to rely more heavily on trucks and horse-drawn wagons. But these, too, came with their own set of challenges. Trucks could be slow and unreliable, while horses were easily exhausted and vulnerable to disease. On top of that, soldiers in the trenches often faced shortages in basic necessities, such as food and clean water. While commanders on both sides focused on strategies for breaking the stalemate, the daily reality for soldiers was far more mundane and brutal. Rations were often insufficient, and the quality of food was poor. Soldiers frequently had to make do with whatever they could find, scavenging what little was left after supply convoys made their deliveries. This lack of proper sustenance, combined with the harsh conditions in the trenches, led to malnutrition, disease, and a sense of desperation. The struggle for supplies also extended to medical resources. Injured soldiers required immediate care, and without adequate medical supplies, even minor wounds could become fatal. Hospitals behind the front lines were overwhelmed with casualties, and stretcher-bearers had to brave the no-man's land to bring wounded soldiers to safety. The constant need for medical supplies, such as bandages, antiseptics, and medicines, further strained the supply lines. As both sides advanced and retreated, medical teams had to be constantly on the move, adjusting to the ebb and flow of the front lines. Perhaps the most critical resource was ammunition. The war was fought with unrelenting artillery bombardments and machine gun fire, and armies needed a constant supply of shells, bullets, and explosives to maintain the pressure on their enemies. The ability to fire artillery over long distances, day and night, often determined the success of a battle. A shortage of shells or a disruption in the supply of ammunition could result in a complete halt to an offensive, giving the enemy time to regroup and counterattack. In the end, the battle for supplies was just as critical as the battle for territory. Control of key logistics hubs, whether they were rail lines, supply depots, or roads, could mean the difference between victory and defeat. Armies that failed to secure their supply lines found themselves isolated, starving, and vulnerable. Those who were able to keep their supplies flowing, however, could maintain their fighting strength, sustain their morale, and continue the fight. Logistics, in World War I, truly became the lifeblood of armies without it. No battle could be won, and no army could survive. The Germans, confident in their strategy, made a critical mistake. The French, led by Joffre, exploit this error, pushing forward with everything they've got. The battle swings in a direction no one saw coming. The Germans are thrown off balance, and the momentum shifts dramatically. What's going through their minds as they realize they've lost the initiative? For months, the Germans had steadily advanced through French territory, relying on their superior tactics and a series of successful offensives. Their forces had been pushing deep into France, causing significant losses to the French and British forces. The strategy seemed sound, and victory appeared inevitable. The Germans believed that their rapid advances would break the Allied lines. forcing a surrender before winter set in. Their plan was to wear down their enemies, using a combination of artillery bombardments and carefully executed infantry assaults. But in the heat of battle, the Germans made a crucial error, a mistake that would ultimately turn the tide of the war. In their confidence, they overextended their forces, pushing too far too quickly, leaving their lines vulnerable. The German supply lines, essential for maintaining their offensive, began to stretch thin. The further they advanced, the more difficult it became to resupply their troops and maintain their positions. They were so focused on the idea of a quick victory that they had ignored the possibility of being stretched too thin. Meanwhile, the French, under the leadership of General Joffre, seized the opportunity. Recognizing the Germans' vulnerability, Joffre ordered a counteroffensive. It was a gamble, but one that paid off. The French forces, bolstered by reinforcements from the British, launched a series of attacks aimed at regaining the initiative. With the Germans now caught off guard, the French pressed forward relentlessly, exploiting the gaps in the German defenses. The French soldiers, once on the defensive, were now the aggressors, fueled by the belief that they could turn the tide of the war. The Germans, taken by surprise, were thrown off balance. Their once confident offensive became disorganized, and their troops struggled to hold their ground. The shock of the French counterattack reverberated through the German lines. German commanders, who had believed they were on the cusp of victory, now found themselves in a desperate scramble to maintain their positions. The rapid advances that had once been their strength were now their weakness, as the French regained ground that had once seemed lost forever. As the Germans fell back, it became clear that the momentum had shifted. The idea of a quick victory was now out of reach. German morale, once high, began to suffer. The soldiers who had advanced with confidence now faced an enemy that was resolute and determined. The realization began to sink in. They had lost the initiative, and the war was far from over. They had underestimated the resilience of the French and British forces, and now they were paying the price for their overconfidence. The turning point came at a critical moment in the battle. The French forces, taking advantage of the Germans' disarray, made significant gains, pushing them back toward their original lines. The Allied forces had seized the opportunity, and the Germans were now on the defensive. For the first time in the war, the Germans were forced to retreat, and the momentum shifted dramatically in favor of the Allies. This moment marked a pivotal shift in the war. The Germans, who had once seemed invincible, now found themselves facing a determined enemy that had learned from the past and adapted to the brutal realities of trench warfare. The Battle of the Marne would go down in history as a turning point, as the Germans' fatal misstep allowed the Allies to regroup, reorganize, and begin a counteroffensive that would eventually lead to their victory. What had seemed like a certain German triumph was now a distant memory, and the tide of the war had changed forever. As the dust settles and the battle ends, the impact of the Marne becomes clear. The Germans are in retreat, and the French have saved Paris, at least for now. But the cost of this victory is staggering. The lives lost, the injuries sustained, the cities destroyed. How do you even begin to process all of this? The world has just been irrevocably changed, and so has every person who was there to witness it. The Battle of the Marne, fought in September 1914, marked a turning point in World War I. The Germans, having advanced deep into France, had been on the verge of victory, but the French, aided by the British Expeditionary Force, mounted a counteroffensive that forced the Germans to retreat. The significance of this victory cannot be overstated. Paris, the heart of France, had been saved, and the German war machine was momentarily halted. But as the fighting subsided, the full cost of the battle began to unfold. On the battlefield, the casualties were staggering. Thousands of soldiers had fallen, and the wounded were countless. For many, the horrors of the Marne were not just in the immediate loss of life, but in the long-term effects of their injuries. Soldiers who survived the battle faced the agony of recovery, many dealing with wounds that would never fully heal physically and mentally. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers who had fought in the hellish conditions of trench warfare were forever scarred by the constant barrage of artillery, the screams of their comrades, and the fear of imminent death. The term shell shock was coined during this time, but it would take decades before the true impact of mental trauma in warfare was fully understood. In addition to the human cost, the battle left a trail of destruction across the land. Villages, towns, and farmland were reduced to rubble. The French countryside, once lush and vibrant, was now scarred by craters, debris, and the ruins of buildings that had stood for centuries. The trenches themselves, a symbol of the brutal nature of modern warfare, became permanent scars on the landscape, some still visible today. The destruction was not just physical, it was psychological too. The Marne represented not just the battle for Paris, but the beginning of a new era of warfare, one in which cities and civilians became as much a target as soldiers. For the people of France, the victory at the Marne was a relief, but it came at an enormous price. Paris had been saved, but at what cost? The toll on the civilian population was heavy. Thousands of families had lost loved ones, and the uncertainty of the war's next moves loomed over them. The government, military, and citizens of Paris had worked tirelessly to prepare for the German assault, and now they had a brief respite. The German retreat was not a definitive end, but merely a temporary setback. The line between victory and defeat had become razor-thin, and everyone knew that the next battle could be just as devastating. In the broader context, the aftermath of the Marne marked a moment of reflection and realization. The world had just witnessed the first of many battles that would define the course of the war. The global implications were profound. Nations had poured their resources into the war effort, and the outcome of each battle would determine the fate of empires. The battlefields of the Marne would set the stage for the long, grueling struggle that would follow, one that would change the geopolitical landscape forever. For those who lived through it, the aftermath of the Marne was a time of uncertainty and change. The sense of victory in Paris was tempered by the knowledge that the war was not yet over. But for many soldiers, the battle had changed them irrevocably. Their experiences would haunt them for the rest of their lives, and the world they returned to would never be the same. The Marne was not just a battle, it was a moment in time that reshaped the course of history, altering the lives of millions and setting the stage for a conflict whose reverberations would echo long into the future.